what keeps the media functioning is not the audience.
They make money from their advertisers. That means that they want to adjust their audience to the more elite and affluent audience. That raises advertising rates. So what you have is institutions, corporations, big corporations, that are selling relatively privileged audiences to other businesses.
Welcome. I'm Ben Boyce. This is the Dr. Junkie Show, and that was Noam Chomsky talking about capitalism in media. Today's episode is about humans, technology, and how the two shape each other in good and sometimes bad ways. I'll also talk about why I don't host commercials, in case you've never heard me explain it. But let's start with a few reminders, and a bit of foreshadowing about where this episode will wind up. Our boy Marshall McLuhan was a popular author in the 1960s, and his claim that the medium is the message went viral even though most people at the time didn't really understand what it meant. It sounded cool, that was part of it, but it also made a lot of sense, even if you couldn't fully grasp it. He was just saying that the technology of any era, the medium of any era, the thing we use to move stuff around, information, people, stories, pictures, money, that technology will inevitably shape us as humans. Sounds simple enough, right? McLuhan's theory also described the best way to predict future trends in technology. Every new technology, said McLuhan, was created as a solution to an old problem. Of course, every new technology also invents entirely new problems, but that's for the next era of ever newer technology to fix. So if you want to predict what the next big thing will be, all you got to do is look at the problems we currently have and consider how they might actually theoretically be solved. Right now, one of the issues we have, an issue I'll fully dissect today, is capital T truth. We don't got it. We all think we got it, but the mediascape we live in has left us unable to fully agree ever, because it's designed to offer alternatives to everybody all the time. The way the internet and social media work, you can find a group of people who sound smart disagreeing with anything. Don't think gravity actually exists? There's a theory for that. Want to know the truth about flat Earth or faked moon landings? Hop online and get to Googling. Do you dislike hearing good things about politicians you dislike? No problem. Just get your news from social media, and the algorithm will quickly recognize your desire to avoid that type of content, and it'll shield your virgin eyes for you. It won't even tell you it's doing it, so you can rest assured in the illusion that your hated politician is actually an awful person and an awful politician. If someone tries to challenge your views along the way, well, they must be wrong. I mean, after all, you've never seen any positive footage of that guy ever. Before we can fully understand our current state of media and humanity, we need to back up and look at why technology showed up when it did. We should go back further than Elon buying Twitter and turning it into a troll fest, back past Zuckerberg's Facebook turned Meta, before Tom friended us all on MySpace, before Rachel and Ross, Zach and Kelly, before Lucy and Ricky even. Way back to before there was TV and we lived with radio. Radio was a technology, so McLuhan would say we ought to think about why it was invented. What problems was it invented to solve? Then he'd ask us to look at how it changed what it means to be a human after it was invented. So let's give this a try. Radio moved information much faster than prior methods of paper or messenger, so it solved the problem of long travel times for information. It also solved the problem of mass distribution costs, because it used to cost a lot of money to get a message to a big group using media. You'd have to design a pamphlet or a booklet, find a printer, hire a delivery guy, and after all that, you gotta hope the person even bothers to read it. Radio managed to take a single voice and play it on 1 million machines to 1 million people all at the same time. So how did it change us? Well, the obvious answer is that it changed where we go to learn about the world. Prior to the radio, if you wanted to know something about politics, weather, local events, you'd buy a newspaper or you'd go to the town to gossip. But once the radio showed up, people learned to tune in for this info. And of course, it also changed how manipulatable we were because, and this is the real point, when it showed up, people weren't used to an audible voice telling them what it claimed was the truth without any pushback from anybody around. This wasn't the town square where Cletus's lies were immediately called out by half the crowd, or where a politician who claimed to be religious or consistent could be responded to in full view of the public. This was a monologue on a new technology. But humans have been learning about the world in a very different way, a way that was the only way many of us knew how to learn at the time. In that way of learning, the listen to the voice speaking, then listen to any voices who can test what that first voice said, and finally make your decision after everyone spoke, it was still the major operating system most of us were running when radio was invented. But the contesting voices largely went away. People had to relearn how to learn. It's also worth thinking about capitalism as we go, because one of the, let's call it a silver lining of corporate ownership of things like radio and newspapers has always been libel law. When you own $1 million newspaper or a radio station in the 1900s, the last thing you want to do is get sued out of existence for broadcasting news that turns out to be false or slanderous. When somebody, say, takes a shot at the president and clips his ear, for example, news programs scramble to find witnesses, friends of the shooter, local police officers, anyone who can tell the public what the hell is going on. During that frenzy, it's likely that some yahoo might get in his head to say, "Hey, put me on the news. I know the shooter. His name's Ben Boyce and he lives with a family of goats. They worship Sonny Bono every Friday afternoon while eating ketchup sandwiches." I don't know why that's the example that came to mind, but there it is. The point is, if this Ben Boyce guy turns out to not be the shooter, but the news reports that he is, using a friend who turns out to never actually have known the guy at all, the news is bordering on libel for not doing their due diligence to make sure the so-called friend wasn't just spreading fake news. So radio shows up to replace newspapers and gossip, and as radio gains power, rich people buy up local radio stations to shore up their power. And as rich people buy up local radio stations, they protected their investments by conforming to some standard of truth, as laughable as that might feel sometimes nowadays, so they wouldn't lose their investment. The system, to some degree, self-policed itself into at least looking like it was seeking capital T truth. Now let's play this same game moving forward through history. Decades after radio, television showed up, and it too solved a problem of prior technologies. The imagination of the listener not aligning with the intent of producers was updated with a literal moving picture. It also solved the problem of some information limits. Now you could show a graph or a chart, or maybe some video footage of an event, and the viewer could get a much clearer image of what you were trying to convey. It also solved the problem, at least from the point of view of media producers, of distracted audiences who might walk away from a radio show partway through if something caught their attention. Now people were less likely to be distracted because TV is a medium of both sight and sound. It requires attention to consume it. Okay, so TV supercharges the same power games that were played with the radio. Once those with wealth realize a medium can be used to influence the public, to garner power, it should never surprise us that they want to access that source of power. And the best way to access it is to run it, to buy it. Much like newspapers in the late 1800s, which started out as mostly local, mostly individual-owned, mostly independent small businesses that reported local news, but were quickly bought out by national corporations who could then dictate which stories ran and what spins were encouraged, even locally. TV and radio followed the same pattern. They wound up going from locally owned, individual, original programming to expensive, multinational, corporate-owned mega conglomerations. And as they did, two things happened. One, the messages we get from different media, it started to align in some gross ways, no matter what station you're tuning into. Chomsky calls this theme across all media outlets a filter as a way to emphasize that only a small portion of the media that can run ever will run. Only a small portion of news that could be covered will be covered. No business or organization deliberately destroys itself. And in media, not destroying yourself means avoiding messages that might hurt the corporation that owns the media outlet you're on. And since we live in a world where media has largely been free for most of our lives, where TV, radio, social media, .coms, all that stuff is free to access as long as you watch commercials or offer up your data to invisible hucksters, we can expect these corporations who control the media to avoid pissing off the people who they need to keep consuming the media and to avoid pissing off the customers who they need to keep advertising on that media. Now, TV, like radio and news, it's a money-making business. It wouldn't exist if it wasn't, because who would make it? If we want to make a film or a TV show or a news program or a podcast nowadays, the number one rule, the only rule in capitalism, is it better make money or it's not going to exist for very long. This podcast is an exception, of course, but I'll get to that later. It's enough to say now that it's not easy to do a podcast like this because it just doesn't fit with the larger social capitalist structure. When I tell people that I don't do commercials because I have a moral issue with them, they usually don't even know what I'm talking about. That's just the way things are nowadays. I mean, how could I have a problem with the status quo? Everybody does commercials. More on that later. For now, let's go back to the media and the corporatization of power we were talking about. In 2024, just to give us an idea of how distilled the ownership of media has become, 7 corporations control and create the majority of media you consume, from news on TV to social media to the movies you watch. 7 corporations, and the powerful people that run those corporations, they decide what you see and what you don't, what counts as news and what is ignored. And of course, rule number 1 being what it is, these owners go out of their way to avoid creating and promoting media that threatens their existence or that paints them in a bad light. They're not going to destroy their own organizations. They actually prefer to remain completely behind the scenes, invisible, so to speak. They prefer us viewers forget they even exist, so we drop our guard and stop questioning why we're seeing, or not seeing, certain perspectives. Now, I've talked about Chomsky's filters in depth on prior episodes, so I won't overdo it here. But the short story is that media has to make money. And to do that, they have to pander to their advertisers while making it look like they're pandering to their viewers, the consumers who they will sell the advertisers' products to for a fee that pays for the production of media that keeps us all tuned in. And who does CBS and NBC and Netflix and everyone else, who do they want watching their shows or reading their news? Well, obviously, in this system, the people buying the products advertised on these outlets. And with just one more small step, you can see that this system is designed to incentivize media outlets to cater to rich people who can afford the most luxurious products because that's who they want advertising on their networks. The rich product owners and manufacturers, the BMWs, not the knockoffs. What would you expect a system like this to produce except bias in favor of wealthy business owners, along with dumbed-down, manipulative sales pitches for products we don't actually need? That's what the mediascape is nowadays. But then, back to that silver lining for a minute. Remember a couple years ago when Fox News got sued by Dominion Voting for lying about the 2020 election? They settled for almost $1 billion, with a B, to avoid going to trial. They clearly didn't disappear with the settlement. They managed to pay up and still remain on the air. But that huge payout points back to that silver lining I was talking about, libel. When huge, rich corporations own media, they're sure to deceive viewers in the name of profit, but they also have to stay within some basic guardrails to avoid lawsuits. You might still see this as a problem that needs to be solved. I mean, the way I just described it, this is a system designed to deceive. A system engineered to pit people against each other and organized in a way that leaves the manipulation hard to spot. How could we even fix a problem like that? And we're back to McLuhan's theory of tech predictions. All technology is created to solve an old problem. With TV, the stories lots of people wanted to hear, the Obama isn't an American, 9/11 was an inside job, that politician you hate actually did inappropriately touch those kids. They can't run those stories on mainstream media without good sources and verifiable claims. They'll get sued, again, if they do. But then comes social media and voila, problem solved. A new technology has arisen to confront an old problem, the problem that we want stories that we often can't get on mainstream media. And same as with all technologies, while it solved an old problem, it created a new one, and it literally changed what it means to be a human in ways that are hard to spot in real time, ways that often don't become noticeable until the future. I can't sue @SusieJ253 on Twitter for saying she saw me commit a crime I didn't actually commit, because she probably doesn't have any money. The medium of social media has changed what it means to be a human, but in a way we can only understand by remembering how the last tech updates changed what it meant to be a human. For decades we learned to basically trust what we saw on media because we knew, even though they might be misleading us somewhat to get us to buy junk we don't need, we knew they couldn't outright lie about some things because they'd get sued. And because of that, we learned to trust media in a way we never would have learned to trust it if social media had come along first. When somebody says, "I knew him in high school and his family is goats," we've been programmed by old tech to assume somebody else already fact-checked this guy and made sure his goat family story holds water. We're programmed to believe without evidence, a result of the old medium of TV. The ancient adage, "if it bleeds, it leads," is also still in full effect. But TV and newspapers were always forced to limit their descriptions and stories to things that, presumably, actually happened. I want to read about Bill Clinton's affair with 20 strippers in the White House, but I can't find anything about it in popular press because, well, it never actually happened. But I can find a ton about it, or Pizzagate, or election fraud in 2020, or any other thing that never happened on social media, and since it bleeds, I'm likely to spend a lot of energy focusing on it instead of focusing on other accounts that might challenge it. In other words, the medium we currently use to interact with the world around us, social media, it fixed some of the issues of old while creating a whole new world of new problems which we've only just started to recognize and haven't even started to fix. We haven't even started to want to fix it. Now, this podcast is still largely about addiction, drugs, crime, and punishment. And social media is about as addictive as it gets for all the reasons I've already mentioned. It's all the addictive parts of TV sped up, concentrated, and warped to a near unrecognizable level. And of course, like religion, you can just about consume it anywhere, quickly or in longer doses, and without much social pushback. It's just kind of accepted. It's a drug that appears on its face to have few negative side effects. But then addictions are defined by quality of life issues. If something you're doing or consuming is not causing negative quality of life issues, well, then it's not an addiction, even if you're physically dependent on whatever that thing is. Antidepressants aren't considered addictions because they usually improve quality of life, but we're also physically dependent on them once we start taking them. Same with coffee. Most of us experience an improvement in our life when we use these chemicals, so we don't classify them as addictions. But with other things, like gambling, they're considered addictions because of the life problems they cause. Cigarettes, for example, might cause you to miss a memory while you're outside smoking, or they might cause you to suffer medical issues related to smoking later in life. In the same way, social media always diverts your attention from whatever else you might be paying attention to, and it drags you into an algorithm net designed to keep you staring at a screen. That doesn't mean it's always bad. Like all drugs, sometimes they work really well. Maybe it makes you feel good when you see a family member online or when you get a notification of a happy memory with a friend. That's not addiction. But if you can also pinpoint times in your normal life when you've paid less attention to important things because you were distracted by social media, or when you missed important information someone was sharing, like most of my students nowadays, at least the ones who aren't incarcerated, if you can see those things in your own life, then you're struggling with addiction. The medium is the message. We live in a world where our technology is designed to addict us, mislead us, and constantly morph into the most potent form of both addiction and misinformation. We got a brand new problem to fix now based on this new technology. So with that dreadful take on social media, I want to jump to a related topic, commercials, and why I don't do them. Now, after listening to the first part of this episode, maybe that's obvious, but let me lay it out for you anyway. In the current mediascape, especially in podcasting, but honestly in all media, money is made when business owners realize that someone's popular enough to trick people into buying a product. You make money when someone offers to pay you to tell a lie. Sometimes a small one, like I really enjoyed this product, but other times a big one, this product changed my life. The Dr. Junkie Show is ranked in the top 5% of podcasts in the world. I know, that sounds wild, but you can search it yourself if you don't believe me. That means I get a lot of auto-send requests to read scripts on the show for money, to sell products. They want me to sell their sunscreen or their e-bikes, and they usually offer a pretty nice payment for doing so, considering I do this podcast for free. So why don't I do it? I mean, couldn't I just be super strict about who I say yes to? Why don't I at least consider reading the scripts for those products that I actually enjoy? I mean, I wouldn't be lying if I actually use the sunscreen or ride the e-bike, right? Well, kind of. But even in that best case scenario where I actually do use the product I'm selling and I truly do enjoy it, I'd still be telling you that because of a paycheck, not because I felt like you listeners should know. And that brings my word into question. Not in a traditional, wait, is he lying sort of way, but in the same way we've been talking about all episode. Not like lying, but also far from being totally honest. The status quo today is to stretch the truth in the name of profit. And that's part of why we all feel like we can't trust media. We know they're lying to us, even when they're not lying. They're always trying to sell us something. Either in obvious commercials where they pitch the products, or in regular programming where the current model means they can't say or do anything that might threaten their commercial advertisers, that might talk shit about the people paying them money to advertise products. In other words, reading commercials for pay doesn't just make you, dear listener, question my honesty while I'm reading the commercial. It makes you question my honesty all the time. Because if I'm advertising for, say, Cheetos for the next 6 weeks, and on week 5 I discover that Cheetos is responsible for the drug war, I'm going to be tempted, hell, I'm going to be required to leave out the worst parts to avoid pissing off my advertiser, my financial lifeline. This entire system is designed to get you to buy, and to get me and other content creators to sell. Operating outside of that system certainly has drawbacks. Most notably, this podcast is out of pocket for me. But it also means you can trust me to at least tell you what I really think without worrying that I'm protecting my revenue by stretching or omitting a truth. You're welcome. Of course, if you want to support this podcast, you can. Most podcatchers have a support the show button, and half of everything donated to this show goes to homeless people, recently released from prison people, or addicted people. But you don't have to. I don't do this podcast for money. I do it for catharsis. Thanks for listening. I'm Ben Boyce.
Well, what point of view would you expect to come out of this? I mean, without any further assumptions, what you'd predict is that what comes out is a picture of the world, a perception of the world that satisfies the needs and the interests and the perceptions of the sellers, the buyers, and the product.